The year is 480 BC. Imagine standing on the shores of Attica, looking north. The horizon isn't glowing with the setting sun, it is burning with the fires of an approaching god-king. For decades, history classes have focused on the 300 Spartans, the naval genius of Themistocles, and the final victory at Plataea. We talk about the strategies, the armor, and the politics. But there is a shadow over this history that is often whispered but rarely examined in full daylight. When the great king Xerxes marched his million-man army into Europe, he wasn't just looking for earth and water. He was bringing a storm that would engulf the very soul of Greece. While the men died on the battlefield, a different, arguably more harrowing fate awaited the non-combatants, the daughters of Hellas. What happened to the women, the priestesses, and the families who couldn't outrun the Persian war machine? The ancient chroniclers give us glimpses, fragments of terror, deportation, and royal intrigue that paint a picture far grimmer than the standard textbook summary. Today, we are peeling back the layers of propaganda and time to uncover the true cost of the Persian invasion. Buckle up, this wasn't just a war for territory. It was a collision of worlds, and the collateral damage was worse than you think. To understand the fate of the captives, we first have to understand the sheer scale of the force bearing down on them. This wasn't a raiding party. This was the largest military mobilization the ancient world had ever seen. Herodotus claims the army numbered over 2 million, drinking rivers dry as they marched. While modern historians temper that number, the psychological effect on the Greek population was exactly what Xerxes intended: total, paralysis-inducing terror. For the women of northern and central Greece, the invasion began long before the first Persian soldier stepped foot in their towns. It began with the rumors. Travelers and refugees brought stories of what happened to those who resisted. The Persian war machine utilized a strategy of calculated fright. If a city submitted, gave earth and water, they were spared, though often heavily taxed and their sons conscripted. But for those who resisted, the men were put to the sword, and the women and children were swept up into the baggage train of the empire. This wasn't just conquest, it was consumption. The approaching army was a moving city of soldiers, servants, and concubines, and it was always hungry for more bodies. Before the Persians even reached Athens, they made an example of Eretria. This is a crucial, often overlooked chapter that set the precedent for what the daughters of Hellas feared most. Eretria had helped Athens during the Ionian Revolt, burning a Persian temple. Xerxes had a long memory, and his vengeance was absolute. After a brutal siege, Eretria fell, betrayed from within. The temples were torched in retaliation, but the human cost was higher. The entire population was enslaved. We aren't talking about simple servitude, this was systematic deportation. The women of Eretria, who had lived their whole lives on an island in the Aegean, were dragged onto ships and sent thousands of miles away to the heart of the Persian Empire near Susa. Imagine the shock: uprooted from your culture, your language, and your geography, never to see the blue waters of Greece again. This event sent a shockwave through Athens. It wasn't just about losing a war, it was about the complete erasure of your identity. As the news of Thermopylae' fall reached Athens, panic set in. The Spartan sacrifice had bought them time, but not safety. This led to one of the most dramatic events in ancient history, the decree of Themistocles. The Athenians decided to abandon their city. They packed what they could and fled to the island of Salamis, Troezen, and Aegina. However, historical narratives often gloss over the chaos of this evacuation. It wasn't an orderly exit. It was a frantic scramble. Women, children, and the elderly were packed onto triremes and merchant vessels. The cries of families being separated, the wailing of those forced to leave behind the sick or the too old to move, echoed across the harbor. Not everyone made it out. Some, particularly the priestesses and those devoted to the religious sanctuaries, refused to leave the Acropolis. They believed the wooden wall prophecy referred to the wooden barricades of the citadel, not the ships. This decision would prove fatal. When we talk about the burning of Athens, we must remember it wasn't an empty city. It was a city populated by the desperate and the devout. When Xerxes finally entered Athens, he found it largely deserted, a ghost town save for the defiant few on the Acropolis. The siege of the citadel was short and brutal. The Persians found a steep, unguarded path, ascended the rock, and slaughtered everyone they found inside the temples. For the women who had sought sanctuary at the altar of Athena, there was no mercy. In Greek warfare, religious sanctuaries were theoretically inviolable safe zones. But Xerxes was there to punish the gods of Greece as much as its people. The temple of Athena Polias was looted and burned. The priestesses who served the goddess were cut down or taken. This was a violation of the highest order in the Greek psyche. It wasn't just murder, it was sacrilege. The image of the holy olive tree of Athena burning became a symbol of the Persian barbarism, but for the women involved, it was the end of their world. They died amidst the melting gold and crumbling marble of their holiest site. For those women captured during the march from Thessaly to Attica, the destination was often the royal harem or the households of Persian nobles. Western media often exoticizes the harem, turning it into a place of Orientalist fantasy. The reality for a Greek captive was far more jarring. The Persian court was a place of rigid hierarchy and immense danger. A Greek woman entering this world was stripping off her previous status entirely. She was no longer a citizen of a polis, she was a chattel of the king. While some might have risen to positions of relative comfort as favored concubines, they were constantly navigating a minefield of court politics, jealousies, and the whims of a monarch who considered himself above earthly laws. They were surrounded by eunuchs and guards, isolated from their kin, and forced to adapt to customs that were alien to the Greek emphasis on monogamous marriage and public visibility. However limited that was in Athens, they became trophies, living proof of the great king's reach. To understand the specific danger women faced under Xerxes, we don't even have to look at Greek women, we can look at how he treated his own family. Herodotus tells a chilling story that reveals Xerxes' character regarding women. He fell in love with the wife of his brother, Mesestes. When she refused him, he married her daughter, Artainte, to his own son, Darius, just to get closer to the mother. Eventually, Xerxes turned his attention to Artainte, his own daughter-in-law, and began an affair with her. This sordid tale ended in horrific violence when Xerxes' queen, Amestris, discovered the affair. She didn't blame Xerxes, she blamed Mesestes' wife. The queen demanded the wife be mutilated, her breasts, nose, ears, and lips cut off and thrown to the dogs. Why is this relevant to the daughters of Hellas? Because it showcases the volatile, brutal environment of the court these captives were sent to. If the king's own sister-in-law could be butchered over a robe and a whim, what chance did a captive Athenian girl have? We touched on this with Eretria, but the policy of deportation was a standard Persian tool for pacification, and it disproportionately affected women and families. The Persians were masters of moving populations to dilute nationalistic uprisings. When a Greek city was taken, the best of the population, often the young women and boys, were selected for transport to the core of the empire. This was a psychological death. In the ancient world, your identity was tied to your land, your city's gods, and your ancestors' graves. To be moved to Babylon or Susa was to become a nobody. Historical records suggest that Greek communities did survive in the East, eventually assimilating, but the initial trauma of the long walk to Asia was a fate many Greeks considered worse than death. It was a complete severance of the maternal line of the polis. The trauma inflicted on the women of Greece didn't end when Xerxes retreated after the Battle of Salamis. The fear of barbarian subjugation became a permanent scar on the Greek psyche, influencing their art and literature for centuries. Look at the plays of Euripides, written decades later. Takes the Trojan women as an example. While ostensibly about the aftermath of the Trojan War, many scholars argue it was a reflection of the suffering the Greeks saw and inflicted during the Peloponnesian War, echoing the collective trauma of the Persian invasion. The lamentations of Hecuba and Andromache regarding slavery, the killing of children, and the concubinage of royal women resonated because the audience knew that fear. They remembered the stories of grandmothers who had seen the smoke rising from the Acropolis. The daughters of Hellas became a symbol of what was at stake: the fragile boundary between civilization and total ruin. The story of the Persian Wars is usually told through the clashing of spears and the ramming of ships. But the silence of the aftermath speaks just as loudly. Xerxes didn't just want to conquer land, he wanted to break a people. And the primary victims of that attempt to break the Greek spirit were the women who watched their cities burn, who were dragged onto ships bound for a foreign land, or who died clinging to the altars of their gods. What Xerxes did was worse than we think, because it wasn't just violence, it was displacement. It was the systematic uprooting of families and the terrified realization that the world was much larger, and much crueler, than the Greeks had ever imagined. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the darker side of ancient history, do me a huge favor: hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think Herodotus exaggerated the brutality of the Persians, or was the reality even worse than he described? Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our next video, where we uncover the secrets of the Spartan upbringing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.